YouTube Live and Facebook Live streams. So we'll get the show on the road, and we really do hope that you provide us with some prompts in your questions. Welcome to the Nonprofit Report, your update on nonprofit organizations, issues, and leaders. I'm your host, Mark Oppenheim. Today, we're discussing archaeological research as a key to understanding our past with special guests. Dr. Laetitia Follette, President of the Archaeological Institute of America in Massachusetts. Dr. William Doelle, President and CEO of Archaeology Southwest in Arizona, and Dr. Deborah Carlson, President of the Institute of Nautical Archaeology in Texas. And a reminder to Zoom attendees that we will take 3 snap polls during the show, and we'll announce results. And your questions submitted through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen will be included in our discussion. So thank you all for joining us. Laetitia, did I get your name right? I just,
yes.
you know.
Brilliant. You did a beautiful job, Mark. Thank you.
Great. I passed the test. So I'll set you up and I'll go over to you, Laetitia. You archaeologists are storytellers, you're detectives, you're scientists, you're sociologists, art historians. But I think the thing that really does resonate with me are the stories that I've learned from your work and from the work of your colleagues. If it were not for archaeological research from amateurs or professionals, we would never have the context for Homer's great works talking about the Iliad and the Odyssey and the destruction of Troy. We wouldn't really know about the founding of our own country and the multiple stories there. We wouldn't understand the threads of history. So I'd like you to start, Laetitia, in terms of the Archaeological Institute of America. What do you do? What do your members do? And what are you trying to advance in our society as a message about the importance of archaeology?
Thank you, Mark. Well, that's a great question. So the AIA was founded in 1879. It was chartered by Congress in 1906. We have over 200,000 members in over 100 local societies in North America. So we have a small group of professional archaeologists who are primarily based in the Mediterranean, although not exclusively. So their work is done in the Mediterranean. I myself am a Greco-Romanist, so I worked both on the Acropolis of Athens, on a building there, as well as on a Roman bath complex on the Aventine Hill in Rome, which was buried underneath a Principessa's Palazzo, so a Roman princess's house. And I'm currently working on a group of Roman marble portraits that were smuggled out of Rome at the end of the 19th century and wound up in Copenhagen. It's one of the only family groups we have of the period of I Claudius, basically, of the 1st century. So the AIA has, its motto is excavate, educate, and advocate. And we support archaeologists' work, both their field work as well as their post-field work. We give a number of grants and fellowships out to working archaeologists as well as graduate students. We also host an annual conference. And we really work at the second piece about educate. We work to educate the public about the importance of archaeology. So we have a national lecture program, which is open and free to the public. If people are interested, you can Google National Archaeology Hour, the National Archaeology Program. And we also have a conference called ArchaeoCon every spring that's for kids and their families. And then the third piece really is to advocate for archaeology. And so we have a site preservation program that has actually supported 33 sites on 5 continents. We believe very strongly in the importance of community engagement around archaeology. We're currently actually raising emergency funds to support archaeologists in areas of conflict, so like in Ukraine and places like that. So let me stop for a second.
And Bill, you're doing your research with civilizations that are as ancient as the ancient Greek civilizations, of which we know a lot more. Talk a little bit about that aspect of your work and why that's so important to understand what's going on in Arizona and how the history has evolved there, even the history that we only see through carvings or images on the side of rock, because that particular culture didn't necessarily carve marble statues and portraits.
So I'm based in Tucson, Arizona. Archaeology Southwest was founded in 1989, and our offices are on the homelands of the Tohono and the Pasquayaqui, and we work across the entire U.S. Southwest and Mexican Northwest, and again, landscapes that are homelands to a diverse set of tribes and communities. So in that, I just want to underscore that we focus on what we call preservation archaeology. So it's a holistic conservation-based approach where we explore and protect important heritage places, but also recognize their diverse values to different communities. So our work, I mean, one of the examples that I'd like to highlight in terms of our long-term research efforts has been to look at a major migration out of the Southwest Four Corners area, and where people had been long established in that area. And we have been invested over 2 decades in this research. And so some folks went maybe 50 miles, others as far as 200 miles into the southern Southwest, and asking questions about, why did people leave a homeland that was, long established? How did they make, develop relationships with the people that were already living in the places they moved to? And how did they deal with conflict and those kinds of issues? So focusing on the material items that are in the past. Migration is a pretty difficult thing to document oftentimes. And also working with modern descendant communities is a really important part of taking the material evidence of archaeology and applying a lot of the great new techniques that we've developed over time. And though having deeper discussions with tribes whose memories go back well into the past. So the idea of collaboration, respect for tribal knowledge, that archaeologists aren't just telling someone else's history. It's a collaborative process that we try to prioritize. So, and
there's so few faint clues, right? And there's so many different theories. There are theories about a drought. There are theories about the lack of crop rotation. There are theories about the religiously based theories. We're trying to find this sense of why people left, in part to inform how we think about today, because a lot of those lessons might be applicable today, right?
Well, I want to jump on one of the why people left phrase there. So much of the stories that archaeologists often propagate kind of give the impression that people are no longer on the land. And I think that's one of the things that they may have moved, they may have, maybe the material remains they leave on the landscape are much more subtle than earlier time periods. And that's one of the reasons that we focus our research efforts and preservation efforts on the Southwest. The connections, so many groups are still here on this landscape. We can work collaboratively with them to try to explore these questions. And oftentimes for the tribal groups, they're actually not questions. They have pretty thorough explanations for them. But let's let other folks jump into the conversation here too.
Debbie, you've been awfully patient. So when you look at our world and you look at how much of the world is covered by oceans, and how much of the world is covered by ocean that previously was not covered by ocean. It's pretty astounding that we have this amazing font of knowledge that is so vaguely explored. Talk a little bit about the Institute of Nautical Archaeology. I mean, that is such a fascinating group of people, and there's so much rich history that we can still explore, isn't there?
Thanks, Mark. I'm delighted to be here today. So I'm president of the Institute of Nautical Archaeology, or INA, as we often call it. Obviously, we're a lot smaller than the Archaeological Institute of America, but we specialize in shipwrecks. We excavate shipwrecks. And, shipwrecks, I think, are unique because they're a kind of time capsule. They are a snapshot on a historical timeline. And if you think of that timeline like a video, then these shipwrecks represent individual frozen moments in time. So many people will liken a shipwreck to maybe, as in a terrestrial context, to a tomb or a site like Pompeii that was obviously buried in some catastrophic event. And in that sense, I think that's accurate, that shipwrecks are like tombs, but they're different in the sense that they were dynamic, right? Because those ships were moving and everything on that ship was headed somewhere. Shipwrecks are also, of course, accidents. They are what some archaeologists call unself-conscious formations, which basically means that their number represents some percentage or some fraction of the whole. And it is fascinating to me to think about the fact that this discipline of nautical archaeology or shipwreck archaeology has really only been around for about 60 years. INA was founded by Dr. George Bass, who is widely regarded as the father of underwater archaeology, just 50 years ago. So it's astonishing to me, and I think also very exciting to think about how much we've learned just in the last half century and how much more there is out there to discover and excavate.
And the techniques of nautical archaeology are so different because you're in an environment that is constantly moving, is very dynamic. It's one of those situations where, as you explore an archaeological site, you have to know that from the moment that you touch that site is going to shift and change. Talk a little bit about how that informs your technique when you do approach an archaeological site, that speed is absolutely of essence, and there needs to be a compromise between speed and meticulousness that strikes the right balance so that you don't end up with a destroyed site and you're gathering as much information as possible all at once.
You're right. The techniques are very different in underwater archaeology, but the goals are really the same. Our goal as nautical archaeologists, using the same principles that George Bass learned on land and then sought to apply underwater, are to excavate thoughtfully, carefully, systematically, and record everything and then publish what we find. So all archaeology is fundamentally destruction, and you can only excavate something once, so you better do it right.
That's such a great point. All archaeology is fundamentally destruction. Could you, Bill, and you, Laetitia, comment on this idea of destruction? Because if you can only do it once, now sometimes you end up with materials that can be analyzed multiple times as technology evolves. How do you ensure that what you're doing has the lightest possible touch and has the most consultation with those people involved, so that you end up with people who embrace your approach and welcome it back, as opposed to feeling offended by the approaches that you take as you do your destructive studying?
Well, there are two things that I would jump in, first of all, and say that your listeners may be really interested in Googling the Gozo shipwreck. I was just in Malta this summer, and there's a big nautical archaeology conference going on there right now. And the Gozo shipwreck, which is of a 7th century Phoenician ship, is actually changing how underwater archaeology is done, because it's at 1,000 feet below the top of the water, and that's really deep. And so the meticulous aspect that you were just talking about is even more complicated. But essentially what you need to do is be meticulous. You have to be very careful about everything that you do, because other people may come along later and do different sort of studies. So a great example, since I was leading a tour of Sicily this summer, recently in the New York Times, about a month ago, there was a study about the skeletons from the site of Himera, Himera, where there was a major battle in 480 BCE between the Greeks and the Greeks on the island of Sicily and the Carthaginians. Well, David Reich, who's a geneticist at Harvard, and his team have analyzed the DNA of 54 of the skeletons to discover, from an excavation that happened a long time ago, that these soldiers were not Greek. Their parents and their grandparents were not immigrants to the island of Sicily. They actually came from places like Latvia, Bulgaria, and the Ukraine. So we're learning about mercenary sort of travel in the ancient Greek world at the beginning of the 5th century. And that's because the material was very carefully preserved. And another example is about the beginning of agriculture. One of my colleagues, Andrew Moore, is working on a site where it's very clear that by analyzing some of the dust that remains from the site, they have found animal dung particles that indicate they domesticated animals at the same time as the cultivation of grain. Now, generally, people thought the two were separate, that the cultivation of cereals happened first and then the domestication of animals happened afterwards. Clearly not the case. This is radically changing our understanding of the beginnings of civilization and basically settlements.
Well, then you can connect that to the fact that Herodotus actually wrote about Himera. So you have now scientists who are looking at dung.
Yeah.
They are looking at DNA. They are looking at then the whole idea of migrations and how societies intersect. And you have a reconception of a story that was told, what was it, 2,500 years ago by a Greek writer who became the prototype of the historian. Bill, you also have another issue in that when you're walking on a site, you are not necessarily equipped to recognize what is significant or not significant. There's so many subtleties that the very track that you're walking on, you could be walking on something that is actually part of an archaeological site. How do you approach that? It's a little bit different than what Debbie was talking about, but that whole idea of creative destruction and just walking can be an act of destruction. How do you approach that?
So yes, I mean, there's some of the landscapes out here are literally the footpaths that people trekked over in the past are still impressed into something called desert pavement. And you can, you don't want to walk over that, or even worse, you don't want off-road vehicles driving over places like that. And to, extend back to your earlier question about, the preservation strategies and how excavation is destructive. We as our nonprofit are focused on less and less on excavation and much more on protection. We recognize that most of the archaeology being done in the United States now is prior to construction projects and that sort of thing. So that we reuse and multiple times information from those kinds of sources. And we actually try to work as much as possible on the surface. We had this one example where I mentioned trails impressed into the ground. There are landscapes out there where we've taken surveyors' little pin flags and marked every single pottery bit that we could see on the landscape. And for about 5 kilometers, traced a trail across the landscape simply by tracing artifacts. And the exciting thing is that trail, the pottery on there goes back at least 1,200 years, and it connects to a song cycle that the folks on the Gila River Indian community, the Akimel Atum, still practice today, which describes their treks across that.
We just lost your sound, Bill. But
Sorry, I whacked my, I moved my hand.
give us the punchline again, because that was
Yes.
really interesting. You said that the trail of pottery connects to the song cycles.
Yes, so it's still a way in which the Autumn people, connect to their heritage by these songs, and this describes a trek across the landscape that again goes back into deep time, and this archaeological trail certainly seems to connect with that as well. So 1,200 years at least of history connected to today and the traditions of the Autumn people here in Southern Arizona.
Now, you're all doing very, very basic research that later on will find its way into a more contextualized understanding of our world. And there will be other storytellers who will take your research and connect it with research of others to create a wholesome picture. How do you interact with people who then use your research, interpret your research? Because in many respects, while you're excavating knowledge from others are excavating knowledge from you and other sources to bring together full stories. How do you ensure that your knowledge gets out there? And secondly, when somebody is using your knowledge, how do you interact with those people, Debbie, who are then using your knowledge for other purposes? How do you ensure that they're understanding it correctly?
Great question, Mark. I think, archaeology moves pretty slowly, both in terms of actual excavation and publication. So personally, one of my, I think, most rewarding experiences as an archaeologist is to get out and give lectures. And the National Lecture Program of the AIA has been fantastic in that regard because, especially in underwater archaeology, where we're limited to, if we're lucky, an hour a day on a shipwreck site. I can't stand over my excavation and study it the way a terrestrial archaeologist can. So our field moves very slowly.
Huge amount of prep and a little itty bitty time window in order to.
That's right. And you better be pretty well organized. You better plan that dive and dive your plan. And then even when you get down to the seabed, sometimes there will be a big moray eel or something sitting in your grid square, and you just have to pivot and do something different. But I think just in terms of outreach and sharing the results from the field, one of the frustrations is simply that, it takes a while in publication for that to happen. So I think the public lectures and the national lecture programs and opportunities like this, frankly, are terrific for getting the word out about archaeological finds and also the interpretations of the archaeologist who excavates these sites. I mean, I think that has to merit to carry more weight than someone reinterpreting it 30 or 40 or 50 years later.
What I find to be so interesting is how you all not only share knowledge so freely, because it's not done in other sectors, the business sector and so on are very often very proprietary about their knowledge, because knowledge is tied to wealth, to profit. But not only do you share your knowledge, but you also welcome challenge. Sometimes welcoming challenge is tough, right? Because you've reached your conclusion. Somebody else says, no, that's not the right conclusion. How do you deal with that emotionally, Laetitia, in terms of being challenged, having cultivated a theory, and then somebody else says, somebody you respect says, maybe not so much.
I love it. I mean, I come from a family that thrives on sort of controversial discussions. I actually grew up in San Francisco. So for those people who are listening from the Bay Area, I say hi. I went to Lowell High School. But I think that, there are a couple of things, and I can't resist, because you actually introduced me as being from the AIA. It's based in Massachusetts. Well, we're all over the country, but our headquarters are in Massachusetts. Right. I have to give an example that's very timely this month. Okay, Thanksgiving, right? So we all know the story of the Pilgrims and Plymouth, what used to be called Plymouth Plantation. Well, the site now is called Plymouth Patuxet, because we are finding out through excavation on Beryl Hill in the modern town of Plymouth that actually the indigenous community of the Wampanoag and the Pilgrims were much more closely linked than people thought. And I have actually, we have this award-winning magazine, Archaeology magazine, which I strongly recommend some of your readers actually look for. In it, I actually have a letter talking a little bit about that work. It's changing the way history is written. That's what archaeology does. Archaeology speaks when history is silent.
How has it changed the way history is written? How has it changed that? Because we all know the history. We all have sort of the standard stories, and there were images, there were great paintings and so on. How has that changed the way history is written?
Well, the example of Plymouth Patuxent is a perfect one. The idea that we all had the pilgrims sort of being in this little fortified compound, and then periodically they would see the indigenous peoples on the outside, is completely not right. The idea that it's all the Greeks fighting, for Sicily against the Carthaginians is not right. They were mercenaries actually who came from further away, but the Greeks don't want to stress that. You mentioned Herodotus. And of course they want to stress that this is, the Greek civilization fighting against the Carthaginians. So archaeology opens up the perspective for other different, viewpoints. And the indigenous one is a great one. The Clotilda, the last slave ship, or the last known slave ship, is another example of how we're learning about people who thwarted the act against slavery in Alabama. And I strongly recommend your readers actually look for the ClotildaStory.com if they're interested in that, and the Descendant movie that Netflix has just released a couple of weeks ago.
Are you all saying that history, the reality of history, is more complicated than the myths we tell about our history?
Yes,
Debbie?
yes.
No, it's a great point you've made about interacting with texts, because this is something Laetitia and I do a lot of, working in the ancient Mediterranean. Herodotus and accounts. I'm thinking of Pliny the Younger's account of the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in AD 79. We can read that account. We can learn from Pliny what it was like to be there. But when we excavate artifacts from that actual eruption, we have an opportunity to interrogate those artifacts in a way that we can't interrogate Pliny the Younger. So the artifacts basically open up a dialogue with the past that we can't always have with the texts.
And other people. In other words, it's not just the elites. We're looking at real people who lived and died at Pompeii and Herculaneum. And that's something that's a different perspective too, because it's not just the people who actually were wealthy enough to be able to spend the time writing, like Pliny the Elder or Herodotus.
Or the seafarers who were so disrespected and disliked by many of the elites.
And the stories that were oral traditions that end up getting encoded in Homer's works, which actually come from an oral tradition. What you have as well, Bill, is you have these oral traditions, these oral stories that come from diverse native societies that then get connected, as you said, to things like pottery trails, right? That whole connection between these various stories that might have previously just been viewed as quaint, particularly by whites, as sort of quaint native stories, but all of a sudden you're able, through that connection, to reveal that there is always that there has been encoded information in those stories that we just were not aware of. We just walked right on by, like we walked by those pottery shards without consciousness.
Artifacts in the archaeological record are reflections of actual behavior, and we have better tools all the time to understand the artifacts, their context, and interpretation. So we've got great resources to put a much bigger picture around history, documents, all those sorts of things that are of great value, but we're an independent source of information, and adding tribal or indigenous views even makes it richer. So it's a great time to be an archaeologist, I have to say.
Now, we just had three different polls. The one that I thought was really interesting was the third poll. First of all, there was 100% support for communal funding, government funding for archaeological research, which is nice.
Great.
It's really important that we understand our past. But the poll that I thought was really interesting, we asked if archaeological research indicates that dearly held beliefs, narratives might not be accurate, when should the new information be revealed and shared with others? And 100% of the people said either as soon as possible, or after new ideas have been peer reviewed. And pretty much there's a consensus that there is some validity to them. But nobody said only after respected leaders in society feel that people can be trusted with the information. I'm going to give you, Laetitia, and then Deborah, I'm going to give you the last word. Nautical archaeology will have the last word on this show. So, Laetitia, in terms of how we should view this idea of different stories and different perspectives, because there has been some real sense that you want to have a particular story and not have it challenged, particularly the whole critical race theory debate that has gone on in this country. There are debates around different perspectives, Native perspectives, LGBTQ perspectives, Latin Hispanic perspectives on history. How do you look at how we should tell our history as a country in a way that creates a real understanding of our history and binds us together? How do you see this?
I think that one of the things that's really critical is teaching children to critically think about the sources of information that they get. I think that's what this is all about, is basically being able to identify fake news and material that actually comes from a valid source. And we're doing this increasingly in high schools. I think we need to start doing it in elementary schools. The AIA is very interested in education. So I think that's critical, because we're always going to be bombarded from different directions with different information. And sifting through that is basically being like an archaeologist, right? We have to be able to do that intellectually. And so that's my answer to that. And I know we're almost out of time, so I want to give Debbie a chance to have the last word.
Well, is fake news, Debbie, also fake history? In other words, if we're talking about fake, are we also talking about creating a historical consciousness that is fake, that is not based in reality? How do you see this?
Yeah, I mean, I think fake news is fake history if it is internalized and accepted. And I think Laetitia's absolutely right that, our challenge before us is really to do a better job of educating. One of the challenges that I have as a nautical archaeologist is educating people about the difference between archaeology and treasure hunting. I encourage people and my students to ask tough questions, ask about the motives of the people who are exploring these shipwrecks. What are they after? Do they represent a nonprofit or a for-profit company? Of course, we want people to invest in archaeology and the proper responsible recovery of the past, because it is ultimately a non-renewable resource.
So what you're saying is the gold in King Tut's tomb is not worth at all what a scrap of knowledge that can be elicited from respectful study of that particular era in history.
Aina is somewhat famous for excavating a late Bronze Age shipwreck off the southern coast of Turkey at a site called Uluburun. And the most intrinsically valuable artifact from that shipwreck excavation is a gold chalice. It is, archaeologically speaking, the least diagnostic because it has no parallels, it can't be sourced, and it doesn't tell us anything really about who was on that ship. So intrinsic value and intellectual, historical, educational value are really not necessarily the same thing.
Bill, you want to weigh in? I was going to give the nautical archaeologist the last word, but Bill, why don't we give the person who is helping to reveal some of these tribal histories the last word as well?
Well, again, I think the discoveries that I, as an archaeologist, might celebrate, we find, I mean, there was some recent footprints in the Southwest that were dated that may be as old as 23,000 years. And that's a remarkable find. It pushes the peopling of the New World potentially, 8,000 or more years earlier than expected. tribal response to that was, we told you so. We've known this for a long time. So again, the valuing, I mean, back to the fake news kinds of issues, yes, we have to be critical of what we get dished out by the media all the time, but also being really sensitive to, in our intellectual endeavors, the very diverse kinds of values that you get brought to the kind of work that we do, and to be respectful and appreciative of the opportunities to do what we do. So
And for your listeners, that's the White Sands discovery.
Yeah.
If they want to Google that, they'll get more information. And by the way, there's a great article about King Tut's his daughters who were mummified in his tomb that we've recently discovered. So there's an article in Archaeology magazine, the latest issue, I think, about that. If people want to know more about King Tut and what we're discovering archaeologically.
As well as the fact that there might be a hidden chamber in the back of the tomb.
Yes,
So,
there are all sorts of great things.
well, you are the storytellers. You are the people who provide the raw materials for revised stories and a better understanding of our world. Thank you so much for sharing your work. Dr. Laetitia Follette, President of the Archaeological Institute of America, Bill Doelle, President and CEO of Archaeology Southwest, and Dr. Debbie Carlson, President of the Institute of Nautical Archaeology in Texas. Thank you so much for sharing this wonderful, wonderful work that you and your colleagues are doing. And please thank your colleagues, thank your board members, thank your financial supporters, thank your volunteers. You are heroes and you enrich our lives.
Thank you, Mark,
Thanks so
for
much,
having
Mark.
us. This
Thank
was
you
a
so
pleasure.
much.